my friend. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about leading with empathy. Some time ago, I shared a series in my church entitled Always and Forever. We dug into relationships, specifically dating relationships and marriage relationships. And it was a wonderful series. Good dialogue was created amongst the church. The feedback was excellent. But there was one particular member who provided regular feedback, but from a different angle. This was not negative feedback. It was actually very helpful. But it wasn't kind of bowling down the center of the lane, as it were. It wasn't something that was just like, I heard these 3 points and man, that resonated with me. No, this person would kind of turn the diamond and allow a little light to shine through that allowed me to think about my messages and the way that this person was receiving them differently. After several weeks of having conversations with this individual, some in person and some via text message, I learned some helpful information about their story that allowed me to listen to them a little bit more empathetically. And this is required of us as leaders, isn't it? We have to learn to lead with empathy. In his book, How to Know a Person, David Brooks talks about the value of empathy. That is to say, when we're getting to know someone or allowing someone to get to know us, whether we know it or not, we want empathy to be an essential factor in the development of that relationship. And let me tell you what, as we develop as leaders, we have to develop that part of our hearts that practices empathy. And today I want to share 2 principles with you that can help you as you apply empathy to your leadership. Number 1, dig into your own story. How well do you know who you are in relationship to where you were raised, who you were raised around or with, and who you were raised by? Do you avoid details of your own personal story? And are you aware that even if you avoid them, it doesn't mean that they are not influential in your life and in your leadership? How would you characterize your formative years between birth and 10 years old? What about between 11 and 20, or 21 and 30, or 31 and 40, and so on and so forth? Because who we are, our quirks, our idiosyncrasies, our strengths, those areas that need development, the things that we are sensitive to more acutely than others, our blind spots, and those things that are very much clear to us, all in some shape, form, or fashion, come from our childhood, our story, our developmental years impact us right now as adults and as leaders. And one way to lead with greater empathy is becoming more self-aware by digging into our own stories. So, for example, if you deal with a people-pleasing complex, if it becomes difficult for you to let go of volunteers or rearrange or realign your current structure, or if it's difficult for you to say no at times, somewhere in your childhood, you received an overwhelming supply of affirmation from those persons important in your life, or you were impoverished of affirmation. And so you seek it as a way of maintaining what you're used to or providing what you never had before. As you dig into your story, you become aware that affirmation is needed by everybody, but in a healthy sense. And that as leaders, our leadership impetus and catalyst cannot be solely to please people or to receive their affirmation. In fact, in many ways, doing the right thing will not yield the type of affirmative response that we want. Leadership is difficult. At times it can be lonely, and it can often be met initially at least with suspicion, with some criticism or some critiques. And then eventually at times individuals can say, this was the best thing to do, right? In the other sense, digging into our story allows us to know if we have developed a self-dependence modality where we do not ask questions and we do not air out ideas and we do not enlist the full input of the team as often or as early or as fully as we ought to make sure that we're making progress together and everyone has a chance to do so. Maybe I was an only child. Maybe I was a middle child. Or maybe I was the youngest child. Now, I'm not making too much of birth order placement in leadership, but I do want to say that as you dig into your story, If you found that you are more of a go-it-alone person, perhaps it was because your parents worked multiple jobs and you knew what it was like to cook food on your own. You knew what it was like to have to figure out how to complete that homework assignment on your own. Maybe you raised funds for yourself to go to college. So you have a kind of, if it's going to be me, if I'm going to put my name on it, I'd rather go it by myself. You're not the group project kind of person. But leadership and participation by extension on a team requires us to be aware of that, because there may be moments where, listen, as much as I feel as though it could be done on my own, maybe it's time for me to learn to delegate. Maybe I'm in a situation right now where I have to first be willing to allow something to be done differently than I would do it if I do it on my own, because I'm not going to do it on my own. I'm going to let this person do it. I'm going to trust and verify, but I'm going to lead with empathy because I know myself. And maybe there's a bit of micromanagerialism coming out, and that's because I'm so afraid of what this will look like and whether or not it will be cast back upon me. That's a part of the risk taking in leadership when we delegate. But when we know ourselves, we know enough to know if I'm releasing this to someone else to do, I've let them do it and they're going to perform it to the best of their abilities. We've had conversations to clarify expectations, but I'm leading with empathy by knowing my own story, knowing my tendencies, knowing my leanings, and that has allowed me to have a level of self-awareness from which I'm able to operate as a leader in this team to let you perform at your highest point of contribution without me fearing as though I'm going to be looked upon as less than as a result of letting something out of my hands. Does that make sense? Here's the second principle for leading with empathy. Respect someone else's story. Respect someone else's story. You are not the only one who has a story. Other people have their stories as well, to include their points of success and their points of suffering, their points of trial and their points of triumph. These individuals have details in their stories, some of which you'll know and some of which you'll never know, that have made them who they are, and how they approach life, how they approach communication, how they approach leadership requires you to have a level of empathy that respects their story. Now, you may not understand it, agree with it, or like it, but you must resist the temptation to judge it by choosing, I'm going to respect the fact that everyone that I'm a part of this team with, everyone on this team that I'm a part of, has a story, to include characters, episodes, experiences, some of which have passed, but they're still feeling the effects of, some that they're going through right now, and some things that you'll only learn after you have left that team, after you no longer lead that team. The nature of my work is I'm a pastor in an organization that operates based on an itinerant model of leadership. In other words, very rarely are pastors in my faith community at any individual church for decades on end. 20, 30 years, whereas it's heard of, it's very rare. And those are anomalies such that they require and enlist their own type of attention. There was a pastor who recently retired after pastoring his church for 40 years. Very odd, very rare. And necessarily that caused not only his church, but churches and entities from around the world to pause and send in tributes to say, we want to commend you and your congregation for 40 years of pastor-pupil relationships, one with another. But for most of us, 3, 4, 5, 7 years, 7 maybe a stretch, 10 even, rare, but 10, man, that requires developing a sense of empathy for the fact that people that you're working with will have stories and have a story that shaped their worldview. And so as leader, I want to become the practitioner of leading with empathy by letting them know I'm digging into my own story so that I can build self-awareness. But as they are kind enough to give you insight into their stories, have they experienced loss of loved ones? Have you been around while a loved one has passed in their lives? I want you to know that requires and invites empathy. Their world has changed, right? What's the relationship like with their children? Do they have children, right? Are there any biases at play that we need to be mindful of that requires a certain level of empathy? Everyone's educational path may be different, okay? And so leading with empathy allows us to dig into our own story and respect the fact that other people have stories as well. And as we come to share story notes, as we come to kind of judiciously apply transparency. We're not taking away the cover on everything. And, listen, I'm an open book. Although if that is the approach that you take, I'm not knocking that, but I'm not recommending that either. I'm just simply saying, as we practice judicious transparency, it allows us to have the opportunity to connect the dots between our stories and say, you know what, our stories show up in various ways in our lives, and it requires us to develop a culture of empathy. Let me know what you're going to apply as you lead your church, your organization, your team, your family with empathy. How are you going to dig in your story? And how are you going to start respecting other people's story? I'm rooting for you as you lead with empathy. I can't wait to see you next time. Until then, God bless you. Peace.